In the winter of 1867, a fire engulfed the Thornfield estate in Cumberland County, Maine. What the fire brigade uncovered in the cellar that evening would shadow them for all their remaining days. Row upon row of glass vessels, each one fastidiously marked with dates, names, and peculiar sigils. Suspended within these jars was what looked to be human brain matter, preserved in an amber-hued liquid that emitted a cloying, saccharine odor. But that was not the most horrifying discovery. Spread across wooden work tables were hundreds of leather-bound journals. Their pages were crammed with intricate sketches of human faces contorted in agony, paired with clinical notes written in a refined, feminine script. The notes detailed something referred to as experimental psychological reconditioning, a process that appeared to methodically chronicle the total mental collapse of human subjects. The local sheriff, Thomas Hartwell, would later recount finding a chamber where the walls were plastered with photographs of the same faces, before and after portraits that displayed a terrifying metamorphosis from normal, healthy individuals to hollow-eyed, vacant shells of their former selves. Each photograph was numbered and cross-referenced with the preserved specimens. For more than 2 decades, the Thornfield sisters had run what they termed a private therapeutic facility for the mentally afflicted. Affluent families from across New England had dispatched their troubled kin to this secluded estate, trusting that the 4 sisters possessed revolutionary curative methods. What they had truly consigned their loved ones to was something far more sinister. A place where the lines between healing and horror had been utterly erased in the name of scientific advancement. The authorities attempted to suppress the specifics of what they found. The official report stated simply that the facility had been operating outside accepted medical standards, but the reality was far more alarming. The Thornfield sisters had been performing psychological experiments that would have been inconceivable even in the most shadowy recesses of European asylums. Before we continue with the story of the Thornfield estate and uncover the full extent of what transpired within those walls, a warning. This channel isn't for everyone, only for the most courageous spirits who dare to confront the darkest chapters of American history. Few channels have the fortitude to tell the stories we tell here. Will you join the select few who know these secrets? The fire that consumed the Thornfield estate was no accident. It was ignited by the only surviving patient, a woman named Sarah Peaton, who had somehow clung to enough of her sanity to comprehend what was being done to her. Cumberland County, Maine, in the 1840s, was a place where old Puritan values clashed with emerging ideas about medicine and the human psyche. The region had prospered from its timber industry and shipping trade, creating a new class of wealthy merchants and industrialists. These families, like their counterparts throughout New England, often faced a particular dilemma: what to do with relatives who displayed signs of mental disturbance. The concept of mental illness was poorly grasped in 1845. Conditions we now identify as depression, anxiety, or bipolar disorder were often viewed as moral failings, or worse, as indications of inherent weakness that could stain an entire family's standing. Wealthy families desperately sought discreet solutions, places where their troubled relatives could be sent away from public view while receiving what they hoped would be effective treatment. It was into this environment that the 4 Thornfield sisters arrived in the autumn of 1844. Constance, the eldest at 32, was a woman of formidable intellect and disquieting presence. She had studied briefly at the Troy Female Seminary in New York, where she had formulated what she called revolutionary theories about the malleable nature of human consciousness. Her sister Margaret, 2 years her junior, possessed an almost preternatural knack for reading people's emotional states and vulnerabilities. The younger sisters, Eleanor and Beatrice, were twins who had cultivated their own dark specialties. Eleanor had trained as an apothecary and held extensive knowledge of plant-based compounds that could alter mental states. Beatrice, the youngest, had spent time in European hospitals and claimed to have studied under physicians exploring the physical foundations of madness. Together, they presented themselves as progressive healers who had devised methods that could cure even the most severe forms of mental disturbance. They spoke eloquently about the need to comprehend the mind through systematic observation and controlled intervention. Their approach sounded scientific, rational, and hopeful, precisely what desperate families yearned to hear. The sisters purchased the old Hartwell mansion, a formidable three-story structure that had stood abandoned for nearly a decade after its previous owner died under mysterious circumstances. The building sat on 200 acres of dense woodland, accessible only by a narrow dirt road that twisted through thick pine forests. The isolation that had rendered the property undesirable to most buyers was exactly what the Thornfield sisters sought. They spent months renovating the mansion, installing what they described as specialized treatment facilities. Local laborers were hired to construct additional rooms in the basement, to fit heavy doors with small observation windows, and to create a complex system of speaking tubes that would let the sisters communicate with patients without direct contact. The renovations were supervised by Constance, who appeared to have detailed blueprints for every modification. She insisted on soundproofing for the basement rooms, explaining this would help cultivate a therapeutic environment free from external disruptions. She also demanded the installation of a sophisticated ventilation system that would allow for the introduction of medicinal vapors into individual rooms. By the spring of 1845, the Thornfield Therapeutic Institute was prepared to receive its first patients. The sisters had advertised their services through discreet channels: private letters to prominent physicians, hushed conversations at social gatherings, and carefully placed notices in medical journals. They promised absolute confidentiality and revolutionary outcomes. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Wealthy families throughout New England began inquiring about the Institute's services. The sisters were selective in their admissions, choosing only patients whose families could pay substantial fees and who could be sent away without raising too many questions about their whereabouts. The first patient to arrive at the Thornfield Institute was James Wentworth, the 24-year-old son of a prominent Boston merchant. James had been suffering from what his family described as episodes of extreme melancholy and inappropriate conduct following his return from Harvard College. Modern psychiatrists would likely have diagnosed him with what we now understand as post-traumatic stress disorder, possibly triggered by a traumatic incident during his studies. James arrived at the Institute on a gloomy April morning in 1845, accompanied by his father and a family physician. The Thornfield sisters met them at the front door, presenting themselves as the epitome of professional competence and compassion. Constance spoke with quiet authority about their treatment methods, while Margaret demonstrated an uncanny ability to swiftly pinpoint the specific anxieties tormenting the young man. The family was given a tour of the public areas of the Institute: comfortable sitting rooms, a well-stocked library, and what appeared to be a standard medical examination room. Everything seemed designed to reassure anxious families that their loved ones would receive the finest care available. The sisters explained that their methods required total isolation from outside influences, so family visits would not be permitted during the initial treatment phase. James's father paid the substantial fee equivalent to nearly $30,000 today and left his son in what he believed were capable hands. It would be the last time he would see his son alive, though he wouldn't learn of James's fate for more than 20 years. What truly happened to James Wentworth began within hours of his family's departure. The sisters had developed what they called systematic psychological deconstruction, a process intended to completely dismantle a patient's existing personality structure so it could be rebuilt according to their specifications. James was initially housed in what seemed to be a comfortable bedroom on the second floor. However, this was merely the commencement of a carefully orchestrated process. Over the following days, his environment was systematically altered in ways meant to foster confusion and anxiety. Furniture was shifted during the night, meals were served at irregular intervals, and the temperature in his room was constantly adjusted. The sisters had discovered that human beings depend on environmental consistency to maintain psychological stability. By introducing seemingly random changes to a patient's surroundings, they could begin to erode the person's sense of reality and self-control. James started to question his own perceptions, wondering if he was experiencing another episode or if the changes were truly happening. Eleanor's expertise with plant-based compounds came into play during this initial phase. James's food was gradually laced with small amounts of substances that would heighten his anxiety and confusion without causing obvious physical symptoms. He began to experience what he described in his journal, which the sisters encouraged him to keep as part of his therapeutic process, as waking dreams and strange visions. The sisters monitored James's deterioration through a network of concealed observation panels and speaking tubes. They recorded every shift in his behavior, every expression of confusion or fear, every attempt to make sense of his increasingly unstable environment. To them, James was not a human being in need of help, but a fascinating specimen whose responses to their interventions could yield valuable data about the nature of human consciousness. After 2 weeks of this psychological manipulation, James was relocated to the basement level of the institute. He was told this was necessary for the intensive phase of his treatment. The basement room where he was placed appeared medical in nature. White walls, a single bed, and what looked like scientific equipment. However, the room had been designed for a very different purpose than healing. The sisters had created what they called controlled sensory environments and spaces where every facet of a patient's experience could be manipulated with scientific precision. James's room could be plunged into total darkness or flooded with blinding light at the sisters' discretion. Sound could be introduced or eliminated entirely. The temperature could be adjusted to create either stifling heat or bone-chilling cold. But the most insidious aspect of James's new environment was the constant presence of the sisters themselves. Through the speaking tube system, they could communicate with him at any time, day or night. They began to engage him in what they termed psychological dialogues, conversations designed to systematically undermine his sense of self and reality. Constance would spend hours interrogating James about his memories, suggesting that events he clearly remembered had never actually occurred. Margaret would engage him in discussions about his fears and anxieties, gradually amplifying them until they became overwhelming obsessions. Eleanor would describe in clinical detail the physical changes she observed in his behavior, making him acutely self-conscious about every gesture and expression. The sisters documented every aspect of James's response to their treatment. They recorded his sleep patterns, his emotional reactions, his attempts to resist their interventions, and his gradual surrender to their control. They were particularly interested in what they called breaking points, moments when a patient's psychological defenses would utterly collapse. James's breaking point came after 6 weeks of systematic psychological torture. The sisters had discovered he harbored deep guilt about an incident at Harvard involving the death of a classmate. By incessantly referencing this event and suggesting James was responsible for far more than he had admitted, they gradually drove him to a state of complete mental collapse. The young man, who had arrived at the institute as a troubled but fundamentally sound individual, had been transformed into something entirely different. The sisters' notes from this period described James as having achieved what they called complete psychological malleability, state in which his sense of self had been so thoroughly annihilated that he could be rebuilt according to their specifications. The transformation of James Wentworth was merely the beginning. Over the following months, the Thornfield Institute received a steady stream of patients, each one meticulously selected based on their family's wealth and their psychological vulnerabilities. The sisters had developed a sophisticated intake process that enabled them to identify individuals who would respond most dramatically to their experimental treatments. They preferred patients who suffered from what we would now recognize as anxiety disorders, depression, or trauma-related conditions. These individuals were already in a state of psychological distress, making them more susceptible to the sisters' manipulations. The sisters avoided patients with conditions that might render them unpredictable or dangerous, concentrating instead on those whose suffering could be systematically amplified and redirected. Each new patient followed a similar trajectory to James Wentworth. They would arrive at the institute hopeful for recovery, only to be gradually subjected to increasingly intensive psychological manipulation. The sisters had refined their techniques with each successive patient, developing what they considered to be a precise science of mental destruction and reconstruction. The basement of the institute was expanded to accommodate more patients, with each room designed for specific types of psychological experimentation. Some rooms were equipped with mirrors arranged to create disorienting visual effects. Others contained mechanical devices that could produce specific sounds or vibrations. The sisters had even created rooms where the walls could be moved to gradually reduce the available space, creating a sense of claustrophobia that would intensify over time. Margaret had developed what she called emotional amplification techniques, methods of identifying a patient's deepest fears and anxieties and then fabricating experiences that would make those fears appear to manifest in reality. She became expert at reading the subtle signs of psychological distress and knew precisely when to introduce new stresses that would push a patient closer to complete breakdown. Eleanor's pharmaceutical experiments grew increasingly sophisticated. She developed compounds that could produce specific psychological effects, substances that would enhance paranoia, increase suggestibility, or create vivid hallucinations. Her knowledge of plant-based chemistry enabled her to create drugs that would leave no obvious physical traces while producing profound mental effects. Beatrice focused on what she termed physiological conditioning, the use of physical discomfort to reinforce psychological manipulation. She developed techniques for using temperature, lighting, and sound to create physical sensations that would support the psychological narratives being constructed by her sisters. The sisters worked as a coordinated team, each one contributing her specialized knowledge to the systematic annihilation of their patients' mental stability. They viewed their work not as torture, but as groundbreaking scientific research that would revolutionize the understanding of human consciousness. By the winter of 1845, the Institute housed more than 30 patients, each one in various stages of psychological reconstruction. The sisters had developed detailed protocols for their treatments, with careful notes about which techniques were most effective for different types of mental disturbance. They began to see patterns in their patients' responses, leading them to formulate increasingly sophisticated theories about the nature of human psychology. The isolation of the institute meant the sisters could conduct their experiments without outside interference. The families who had sent their relatives to the facility received regular letters written by the sisters but purportedly from the patients themselves, describing their progress and their gratitude for the excellent care they were receiving. These letters were carefully crafted to reassure families while providing plausible explanations for why visits were still not advisable. Local residents in Cumberland County began to notice peculiar things about the Thornfield Institute. Deliveries of unusual supplies, large quantities of medical equipment, strange chemicals, and what appeared to be scientific instruments arrived regularly. The sisters employed very few local workers, preferring to handle most of the Institute's operations themselves. Those who did work at the Institute reported unsettling experiences. Groundskeepers spoke of hearing strange sounds emanating from the basement, particularly during the night. Delivery workers noticed that the sisters insisted on receiving all packages personally and would not allow outsiders to enter the building unsupervised. Most disturbing were the reports from local physicians, who had been consulted by the sisters about various medical supplies and equipment. Dr. Samuel Crawford, who practiced in nearby Portland, later testified that Constance Thornfield had inquired about techniques for preserving human tissue samples and had asked detailed questions about the effects of various drugs on mental function, but perhaps the most telling sign that something was terribly amiss at the Institute came from an unexpected source. In the spring of 1846, a young woman named Mary Hutchinson escaped from the facility and found her way to the town of Falmouth, nearly 15 miles away. She was discovered wandering the streets in a state of complete disorientation. Unable to recall her own name or explain how she had arrived, Mary was taken to the local physician, Dr. Edmund Foster, who was appalled by her condition. She exhibited signs of severe psychological trauma and appeared to be suffering from what we would now recognize as a dissociative disorder. More alarming were the physical indicators of her ordeal, evidence of prolonged confinement, malnutrition, and what seemed to be systematic abuse. Dr. Foster attempted to help Mary recover her memory and identity. Over several weeks, fragments of her experience at the Thornfield Institute began to surface. She spoke of being kept in a small room with no windows, of voices that would speak to her through the walls, and of strange substances that were forced into her food and drink. Most chilling were Mary's descriptions of the sisters themselves. She spoke of women who would observe her constantly, taking notes on her behavior and responses. She described being subjected to various treatments that seemed designed to shatter her sense of self rather than heal her mind. Dr. Foster was deeply troubled by Mary's account and attempted to investigate the Thornfield Institute. However, when he contacted the facility, he was informed that no one named Mary Hutchinson had ever been a patient there. The sisters claimed Dr. Foster had been deceived by a delusional woman who had fabricated her entire story. The incident was reported to local authorities, but the investigation was brief and inconclusive. The sisters' reputation as legitimate medical practitioners, combined with their connections to prominent families throughout New England, shielded them from serious scrutiny. The case was closed after the sisters provided documentation that appeared to account for all their patients. Mary Hutchinson was placed in a county asylum, where she died 6 months later. The official cause of death was listed as mental exhaustion, but Dr. Foster suspected she had been deliberately poisoned. However, he had no evidence to support his suspicions, and the case was forgotten. The incident did have one lasting effect. Dr. Foster began to quietly investigate other reports of unusual activities at the Thornfield Institute. Over the following months, he documented a pattern of strange occurrences that suggested the sisters were conducting activities far beyond the scope of legitimate medical practice. Dr. Foster's investigation into the Thornfield Institute began to reveal a disturbing pattern of deception and manipulation that extended far beyond the facility itself. Through careful inquiry among his medical colleagues throughout New England, he discovered the sisters had been making inquiries about experimental treatments and unusual medical supplies at multiple locations. Dr. Harrison Webb, a physician in Boston, reported that Constance Thornfield had visited his practice in early 1845, claiming to be researching advanced techniques for treating mental disturbance. She had asked detailed questions about the effects of various drugs on brain function and had inquired about methods for preserving human tissue samples for extended periods. Similar reports came from physicians in Providence, Hartford, and Portsmouth. The sisters had been systematically gathering information about experimental medical techniques, psychological theories, and pharmaceutical compounds. They had presented themselves as legitimate researchers working on behalf of a private medical institute developing revolutionary treatments for mental illness. More troubling were the reports from apothecaries and medical supply companies. Eleanor Thornfield had been purchasing large quantities of substances that had no legitimate medical use. Compounds known to produce hallucinations, increase suggestibility, or cause severe psychological distress. She had also acquired equipment that seemed designed for restraining patients rather than treating them. Dr. Foster began to suspect the Thornfield Institute was not simply using unorthodox treatment methods, but was actually conducting systematic experiments on human subjects. The sisters appeared to be using their patients as test subjects for psychological and pharmaceutical research that would have been considered unethical even by the standards of the 1840s. His investigation received an unexpected boost in the summer of 1846 when he was contacted by a former employee of the Institute. Martha Henley had worked as a cook at the facility for several months before abruptly leaving her position. She had been reluctant to discuss her experiences, but Dr. Foster's gentle questioning eventually persuaded her to reveal what she had witnessed. Martha's account was both specific and deeply disturbing. She described a facility where patients were kept in basement rooms that resembled prison cells more than medical treatment areas. She had been instructed to prepare meals according to very specific instructions, including the addition of substances that Eleanor Thornfield provided. These substances had strange effects on the patients, causing them to become either extremely agitated or unnaturally calm. Most chilling was Martha's description of the sisters' behavior toward their patients. She had observed them conducting what appeared to be experiments rather than treatments. Patients would be subjected to various stimuli, loud noises, bright lights, extreme temperatures, while the sisters carefully recorded their responses. Martha also described the extensive record-keeping the sisters maintained. They kept detailed journals about each patient's condition, behavior, and responses to various treatments. These records were maintained with scientific precision, suggesting the sisters viewed their work as research rather than healing. The cook's testimony provided Dr. Foster with crucial evidence, but it also revealed the extent of the sisters' careful planning. Martha had been hired from outside the local community and had been required to sign an agreement prohibiting her from discussing her work at the Institute. Similar agreements had been signed by the few other employees who had worked at the facility. Dr. Foster realized the sisters had created an elaborate system to conceal their activities. They had carefully isolated the Institute from outside scrutiny, maintained false documentation about their patients, and intimidated potential witnesses into silence. The scope of their deception suggested they had been planning their psychological experiments for years. Before actually implementing them, the investigation took a dramatic turn in the autumn of 1846, when Dr. Foster received a letter from an unexpected source. The letter was from James Wentworth's father, who had grown increasingly concerned about his son's prolonged absence from family events and his failure to respond to letters. The elder Wentworth had been assured by the sisters that his son was making excellent progress and that continued isolation was necessary for his recovery. However, he had begun to suspect something was wrong when the letters supposedly written by his son began to exhibit dramatic changes in handwriting and vocabulary. The letters James had supposedly written during his first months at the Institute were consistent with his previous correspondence, intelligent, articulate, and written in his distinctive hand. However, the more recent letters were dramatically different. The handwriting appeared shaky and uncertain, the vocabulary was much simpler, and the content suggested James had undergone a fundamental change in personality. Dr. Foster compared the early and late letters and immediately recognized they had been written by different people. The sisters had apparently been forging correspondence from James, and their forgeries had become increasingly crude as time passed. This suggested something had happened to James that prevented him from writing his own letters. The investigation was further complicated by the discovery that similar patterns existed in correspondence from other patients at the Institute. Families throughout New England had been receiving letters from their relatives that showed dramatic changes in handwriting, vocabulary, and personality. The sisters had been systematically forging communications to conceal the true condition of their patients. Dr. Foster began to piece together the horrifying truth about the Thornfield Institute. The sisters were not treating mental illness. They were systematically destroying the minds of their patients through psychological torture and pharmaceutical manipulation. The patients who had been sent to the facility for healing had instead been subjected to experiences that had permanently damaged their mental faculties. The scope of the sisters' crimes was staggering. Over nearly 2 years, they had received more than 60 patients from prominent families throughout New England. Each patient had undergone systematic psychological destruction, with the sisters carefully documenting the process as if it were legitimate scientific research. What made the situation even more disturbing was the realization that the sisters appeared to believe their work was scientifically valuable. Their careful record-keeping and systematic approach suggested they viewed their patients not as human beings but as experimental subjects whose suffering could contribute to the advancement of knowledge about human psychology. Dr. Foster knew he had uncovered evidence of crimes that were unprecedented in their scope and cruelty. However, he also realized bringing the sisters to justice would be extremely difficult. They had powerful connections throughout New England, and their victims were individuals whose families had every reason to avoid public scrutiny of their relatives' mental health issues. The investigation reached a critical point in the winter of 1847 when Dr. Foster received information that would finally provide him with the evidence needed to expose the Thornfield Institute. The information came from the most unexpected source imaginable, one of the sisters themselves. The information that would ultimately lead to the exposure of the Thornfield Institute came from Beatrice Thornfield, the youngest of the four sisters. In February 1847, she appeared at Dr. Foster's office in Portland, exhibiting signs of severe psychological distress and claiming she could no longer participate in what she called the horrible work being conducted at the Institute. Beatrice's appearance was shocking to Dr. Foster, who had previously encountered her only as a composed and professional medical practitioner. She was visibly agitated, spoke in rapid, disconnected sentences, and seemed to be suffering from the same type of psychological trauma he had observed in Mary Hutchinson. The irony was not lost on Dr. Foster that one of the sisters appeared to be exhibiting symptoms similar to those of their victims. Through careful questioning, Dr. Foster learned Beatrice had been experiencing what she called attacks of conscience about the work being conducted at the Institute. She had initially believed their psychological experiments were contributing to legitimate scientific knowledge about mental illness. However, she had gradually come to understand they were systematically destroying human lives for no purpose other than their own intellectual curiosity. The breaking point for Beatrice had come when she witnessed the death of a patient named Thomas Bellingham, a young man from a prominent Providence family, sent to the Institute for treatment of what would now be recognized as severe depression. The sisters had subjected Thomas to an experimental treatment involving complete sensory deprivation combined with pharmaceutical manipulation, designed to create terrifying hallucinations. The treatment had been designed to test the sisters' theory that extreme psychological stress could be used to reset a patient's mental state, allowing them to rebuild the person's personality from the ground up. However, Thomas had not responded to the treatment as expected. Instead of achieving the psychological breakdown the sisters had intended, he had suffered what appeared to be a complete mental collapse that resulted in his death. Beatrice described finding Thomas in his cell, having apparently died of what she believed was sheer terror. His body showed no signs of physical injury, but his face was frozen in an expression of absolute horror. The sisters had disposed of his body in a manner Beatrice refused to describe in detail, but she indicated they had taken steps to ensure no evidence of his death would ever be discovered. The death of Thomas Bellingham had forced Beatrice to confront the reality of what she and her sisters were doing. She realized they had long since abandoned any pretense of medical treatment and were conducting psychological experiments that had no purpose other than to satisfy their own curiosity about the limits of human mental endurance. Dr. Foster learned the sisters had developed increasingly extreme experimental protocols over the course of their work. They had created treatments designed to produce specific types of psychological breakdown, with careful attention to documenting the process and the results. Each patient had become a test subject for theories about human consciousness the sisters were developing through systematic torture. Beatrice provided Dr. Foster with detailed information about the Institute's operations, including the locations of hidden rooms, the methods used to restrain and manipulate patients, and the extensive documentation the sisters maintained about their experiments. She also revealed that sisters had been in contact with other physicians throughout Europe and America who were conducting similar research. The information suggested the Thornfield Institute was part of a broader network of individuals conducting unauthorized experiments on human subjects. The sisters had been corresponding with physicians in Germany, France, and other American cities, sharing their techniques and results. The scope of the psychological research being conducted was far broader than Dr. Foster had imagined. Most disturbing was Beatrice's revelation that the sisters had been planning to expand their operations. They had been in negotiations to acquire additional facilities and had been recruiting other physicians to join their research. The Thornfield Institute was intended to be the first of many such facilities that would advance their understanding of human psychology through systematic experimentation on unwilling subjects. Dr. Foster realized he was dealing with a conspiracy that extended far beyond the four sisters. The psychological experiments being conducted at the Institute were part of a broader movement among certain physicians who believed traditional ethical constraints were hindering scientific progress. These individuals were willing to sacrifice human lives in pursuit of knowledge about the human mind. The investigation took on new urgency when Beatrice revealed the sisters were planning to eliminate evidence of their activities. They had become aware their work was attracting unwanted attention, and they were preparing to destroy their documentation and dispose of their remaining patients. The sisters had discussed methods for killing their patients in ways that would not leave obvious evidence of murder. Dr. Foster knew he had to act quickly to prevent the sisters from carrying out their plan. However, he also realized approaching local authorities would be extremely difficult. The sisters had powerful connections throughout New England, and their victims were individuals whose families had every reason to avoid public scrutiny. The situation became even more complicated when Beatrice revealed her sisters had become suspicious of her loyalty to their cause. They had begun to monitor her activities and had suggested she might need to undergo treatment herself if she continued to express doubts about their work. Beatrice was essentially a prisoner at the Institute, forced to participate in activities she now found morally reprehensible. Dr. Foster developed a plan to expose the sisters' activities while protecting Beatrice from retaliation. He would need to gather additional evidence about the Institute's operations, document the fate of specific patients, and find a way to present this information to authorities who would be willing to act despite the sisters' powerful connections. The plan required careful coordination and precise timing. Dr. Foster knew he would have only one opportunity to expose the sisters' crimes before they could destroy the evidence and eliminate the witnesses. The success of his investigation would depend on his ability to document the full scope of the psychological experiments being conducted at the Institute. As winter turned to spring in 1847, Dr. Foster prepared to take action against the Thornfield Institute. He had gathered evidence of systematic psychological torture, documented the deaths of multiple patients, and identified the broader network of physicians conducting similar experiments. The time had come to bring the sisters' reign of terror to an end. However, Dr. Foster was unaware the sisters had discovered his investigation and were preparing their own response. The confrontation about to unfold would reveal the full extent of their crimes and the depths of their commitment to their twisted vision of scientific progress. The confrontation between Dr. Foster and the Thornfield sisters began on a fog-shrouded morning in April 1847. Dr. Foster had arranged for a small group of trusted colleagues and local officials to accompany him to the Institute, ostensibly for a routine medical inspection. The group included Dr. Marcus Whitman from the Portland Medical Society, Sheriff William Hartwell from Cumberland County, and 2 deputies carefully selected for their discretion. The sisters received the inspection team with their usual professional composure, but Dr. Foster immediately noticed signs of tension in their behavior. Constance spoke with forced calm about the Institute's excellent reputation and their revolutionary treatment methods. Margaret seemed unusually alert to the visitors' reactions, studying their faces with an intensity suggesting she was evaluating them as potential threats. The inspection began in the public areas of the Institute, which had been carefully maintained to present an impression of legitimate medical practice. The sisters provided a detailed tour of their treatment facilities, explaining their methods with the same scientific authority that had initially convinced families to entrust their relatives to their care. However, Dr. Foster had come prepared with specific questions based on the information provided by Beatrice. He asked to see the Institute's patient records, inquiring about specific individuals who had been admitted to the facility. The sisters provided documentation that appeared to account for all their patients, but Dr. Foster noticed subtle inconsistencies in the records that confirmed his suspicions about forged correspondence. The critical moment came when Dr. Foster requested to meet with several patients to assess their progress personally. The sisters initially resisted this request, explaining their treatment methods required complete isolation from outside influences. However, Sheriff Hartwell insisted the inspection team be allowed to verify the well-being of individuals placed in the sisters' care. Constance agreed to the request, but insisted patient interactions be limited to prevent disruption of their treatment. She led the inspection team to a common area where several patients were seated in chairs arranged in a neat row. Dr. Foster was immediately struck by the patient's appearance. They sat with vacant expressions, showing no recognition of the visitors and no apparent awareness of their surroundings. The patients had been arranged to present an impression of calm contentment. But Dr. Foster recognized the signs of severe psychological trauma. Their movements were mechanical and lifeless. Their responses to questions were limited to simple, repetitive phrases, and their eyes showed no sign of the intelligence and personality that had once defined them as individuals. When Dr. Foster attempted to engage the patients in conversation, it became clear they had been subjected to psychological manipulation that had fundamentally altered their mental capabilities. They could respond to basic commands and answer simple questions, but they showed no signs of independent thought or emotional response. The sisters had achieved their goal of creating psychologically malleable individuals, but the result was the complete destruction of their patients' humanity. The inspection team was shown additional patients who exhibited similar symptoms. Each individual had been reduced to a state of complete dependency, unable to care for themselves or make any decisions about their own lives. They had been transformed from functioning human beings into living automatons, who existed only to validate the sisters' theories about human consciousness. Sheriff Hartwell demanded to see the patient records for the individuals they had observed. The sisters provided documentation describing the patient's treatment in clinical terms, but Dr. Foster recognized the records actually documented systematic psychological torture. The sisters had carefully recorded each step in the process of destroying their patients' minds, treating human suffering as data to be analyzed and studied. The confrontation reached its climax when Dr. Foster demanded to see the basement facilities where the sisters conducted their intensive treatments. The sisters initially refused, claiming the basement areas were not suitable for visitors and that patient confidentiality required limiting access to treatment areas. However, Beatrice had provided Dr. Foster with detailed information about the basement layout, including the locations of hidden rooms and concealed passages. When Sheriff Hartwell threatened to obtain a search warrant, the sisters realized their carefully constructed facade was beginning to crumble. Constance led the inspection team to the basement, maintaining her professional demeanor even as she showed them rooms containing equipment designed for restraining and torturing human beings. She explained each device and technique with clinical detachment, describing the psychological effects of various treatments as if discussing legitimate medical procedures. The basement contained multiple rooms specifically designed for different types of psychological experimentation. One room was equipped with mirrors arranged to create disorienting visual effects. Another contained mechanical devices that could produce specific sounds or vibrations. A third room had been designed to create the sensation of being buried alive, with walls that could be moved to gradually reduce the available space. Most disturbing was the room the sisters called their specimen preservation laboratory. This room contained hundreds of glass containers filled with human brain tissue preserved in chemical solutions the sisters had developed For their research, each container was labeled with detailed information about the patient from whom the tissue had been taken and the specific psychological condition induced before the tissue was harvested. Dr. Foster realized the sisters had been systematically killing their patients and preserving their brain tissue for study. They had developed techniques for inducing specific psychological states and then examining the physical changes that occurred in the brain as a result of their treatments. The patients had been treated not as human beings, but as laboratory animals whose suffering could contribute to scientific knowledge. The inspection team also discovered extensive documentation of the sisters' research, including detailed journals describing their experimental methods and theories about human consciousness. The sisters had been corresponding with physicians throughout Europe and America, sharing their techniques and results. They had viewed their work as groundbreaking, scientific research that would revolutionize the understanding of human psychology. The confrontation reached its breaking point when Sheriff Hartwell discovered a room containing the bodies of patients who had died during treatment. The sisters had preserved these bodies using chemical techniques Eleanor had developed, maintaining them as what they called permanent specimens for ongoing study. The room contained more than 20 bodies, each one carefully labeled with information about the psychological experiments conducted before death. Constance maintained her composure even when faced with undeniable evidence of mass murder. She explained the deaths had been necessary for the advancement of scientific knowledge and that their research would ultimately benefit humanity by providing new understanding of mental illness. She showed no remorse for the suffering they had caused and seemed genuinely puzzled by the horror expressed by the inspection team. The sisters were immediately arrested, but the full extent of their crimes would not be revealed until investigators spent weeks examining the extensive documentation they had maintained. The records revealed they had systematically tortured and killed more than 70 patients over nearly 3 years, treating each death as a valuable contribution to their research. The investigation also revealed the broader network of physicians who had been collaborating with the sisters in their research. Letters and documents found at the Institute provided evidence of similar experiments being conducted at facilities throughout the United States and Europe. The Thornfield Institute had been part of a secretive movement among certain medical practitioners who believed traditional ethical constraints were hindering scientific progress. The trial of the Thornfield sisters became one of the most sensational criminal cases of the 19th century. The evidence presented during the proceedings revealed the full scope of their psychological experiments and the systematic nature of their crimes. However, the trial also exposed the complicity of the medical establishment and the wealthy families who had enabled their activities. Many prominent physicians testified about their interactions with the sisters, revealing warning signs about their activities had been ignored or dismissed. The medical community had been so eager to embrace new treatments for mental illness, they had failed to question the sisters' methods or investigate reports of unusual activities at their institute. The families of the victims faced a terrible dilemma during the trial. While they wanted justice for their murdered relatives, they also feared the public exposure of their family members' mental health issues. Many families had sent their relatives to the institute specifically to avoid public scrutiny, and the trial forced them to confront the consequences of their decisions. The trial revealed the sisters had been motivated not by malice, but by a twisted belief their research was scientifically valuable. They had developed elaborate theories about human consciousness and believed their experiments were advancing the understanding of mental illness. Even when faced with the death penalty, they maintained their work had been justified by its potential contributions to medical knowledge. Constance Thornfield was the most unrepentant of the sisters. During her testimony, she explained her theories about psychological manipulation and described the results of her experiments with clinical detachment. She seemed genuinely bewildered by the public outrage over her work and maintained future generations would recognize the value of her contributions to science. Margaret Thornfield focused on the psychological aspects of their research, describing in detail the techniques they had developed for manipulating human consciousness. Her testimony provided valuable insight into the methods they had used, but it also revealed the complete absence of empathy that had enabled her to treat human beings as experimental subjects. Eleanor Thornfield testified about the pharmaceutical aspects of their work, describing the compounds she had developed for altering mental states. Her knowledge of chemistry had been crucial to the sisters' ability to manipulate their patients, and her testimony revealed the sophisticated nature of their experimental methods. Beatrice Thornfield cooperated fully with prosecutors, providing detailed testimony about the Institute's operations and expressing genuine remorse for her participation in the experiments. Her decision to expose her sister's activities had been crucial to bringing them to justice, but she also faced charges for her role in the murders. The trial lasted for 6 months and attracted national attention. Newspapers throughout the country covered the proceedings in detail, and the case sparked widespread debate about medical ethics and the regulation of experimental treatments. The revelations about the sisters' activities led to new laws governing medical practice and the treatment of mental illness. The 3 eldest sisters were sentenced to death for their crimes, while Beatrice received a sentence of life imprisonment in recognition of her cooperation with authorities. However, the executions were delayed for years due to appeals and legal challenges, during which the sisters continued to maintain their innocence and defend their research. Constance Thornfield died in prison in 1851, reportedly still working on scientific papers about human consciousness. Margaret died 2 years later, having spent her final years conducting what she called psychological experiments on fellow prisoners. Eleanor survived until 1855, when she was found dead in her cell with evidence suggesting she had been developing chemical compounds using materials smuggled into the prison. Beatrice Thornfield served 30 years in prison before being released in 1877. She spent her remaining years working with organizations that provided care for individuals with mental illness, dedicating her life to making amends for her participation in her sister's crimes. She died in 1889, having never spoken publicly about her experiences at the Thornfield Institute. The institute itself was destroyed by fire in 1848 under circumstances never fully explained. Local residents reported seeing strange lights in the building on the night of the fire, and some claimed to have heard sounds resembling human voices coming from the ruins. The fire was so intense it burned for 3 days, completely destroying all evidence of the sisters' activities. The site of the institute remained abandoned for decades after the fire. Local residents avoided the area, reporting the location had an unsettling atmosphere that made them uncomfortable. Several attempts were made to rebuild on the site, but each project was abandoned after workers reported disturbing experiences they could not explain. In 1895, the state of Maine acquired the property and converted it into a memorial park dedicated to the victims of the Thornfield Institute. The memorial includes a simple stone monument listing the names of the 73 individuals who died at the facility, along with a brief description of the crimes committed there. The case of the Thornfield sisters had a lasting impact on the practice of medicine in the United States. New regulations were established to govern experimental treatments, and medical institutions were required to maintain detailed records of their activities. The case also led to increased scrutiny of private medical facilities and the development of patient advocacy organizations. However, questions about the sisters' activities continued to emerge long after their deaths. Researchers who studied their documentation discovered references to other facilities and collaborators never fully investigated. Some historians believe the Thornfield Institute was part of a broader network of experimental facilities that continued to operate in secret for decades after the sisters' trial. Modern psychiatrists who have studied the sisters' methods recognize them as sophisticated forms of psychological torture that anticipated many techniques later used in military and intelligence applications. The sisters had developed systematic methods for breaking down human personality that would not be fully understood by mainstream psychology until the mid-20th century. The story of the Thornfield sisters serves as a chilling reminder of what can happen when scientific curiosity is divorced from human compassion. Their crimes were made possible not only by their own moral blindness, but by a medical establishment too eager to embrace new treatments, and a society willing to hide its problems rather than address them directly. The families who sent their relatives to the institute were also victims of the sisters' deception, but their desire to avoid public scrutiny of mental illness enabled the sisters to continue their activities for years without detection. The case highlights the dangers of stigmatizing mental health issues and the importance of maintaining oversight of medical institutions. Today, the memorial park standing on the site of the Thornfield Institute serves as a quiet reminder of one of the darkest chapters in American medical history. Visitors to the park often report feeling a sense of unease they cannot explain, as if the suffering that occurred there has left a permanent mark on the landscape. The documentation that survived the sisters' activities continues to be studied by historians and psychologists seeking to understand the motivations behind their crimes. Their research methods, while morally reprehensible, provided insights into human psychology that have contributed to our modern understanding of trauma, manipulation, and the resilience of the human mind. The case also raises disturbing questions about other historical cases of medical experimentation that may have been covered up or forgotten. Historians continue to discover evidence of unauthorized experiments conducted on vulnerable populations throughout American history, suggesting the Thornfield sisters were not unique in their willingness to sacrifice human lives for scientific knowledge. What do you think happened to the other facilities the sisters mentioned in their correspondence? Were there other physicians conducting similar experiments who were never caught? The truth about the full extent of these psychological experiments may never be known, but the legacy of the Thornfield sisters serves as a permanent warning about the dangers of unchecked scientific ambition. Leave your thoughts in the comments below, and remember to subscribe if you dare to explore more of history's darkest secrets. The stories we tell here aren't for everyone, only for those brave enough to confront the most disturbing truths about human nature.